Minneapolis is often pictured as quiet, peaceful, and safe, but beneath that calm exterior lies one of America's most violent and misunderstood street wars. A conflict born from generations of poverty, fractured neighborhoods, and the brutal split between two of the city's most notorious factions, the highs and the lows. Today we dive into the real arrests, the real victims, and the real criminal networks that law enforcement says have turned entire blocks into battlegrounds. Before we begin, if you want more real, fact-based crime documentaries, make sure to hit subscribe right now. Welcome back to the channel, where we break down real stories, real crimes, and real investigations the mainstream news rarely explains in full. If you love deep dive crime documentaries, do me one quick favor. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because the story you're about to hear is one of the most complex gang feuds in modern Midwestern history, a war that erupted in Minneapolis and sent shockwaves throughout Minnesota. This isn't fiction. These aren't myths. Everything you're about to hear is pulled from documented arrests, police indictments, court records, and verified reporting. The highs, the lows, and several other Minneapolis sets have been locked in a cycle of retaliation that shaped entire neighborhoods and changed hundreds of lives. Today we go deep into the arrests, the investigations, and the internal conflicts that fueled Minneapolis' deadliest street battles. To understand the modern Minneapolis gang landscape, and how the highs and lows came to dominate crime headlines, you have to go back to the roots of North Minneapolis, long before the indictments, the task forces, and the viral headlines about gang crackdowns. North Minneapolis, often referred to simply as the Northside, has lived through waves of economic challenges dating all the way back to the decline of major manufacturing industries in the late 20th century. As factories closed and jobs moved away, many neighborhoods were left with rising unemployment, deteriorating housing, and a growing sense of abandonment. Community leaders warned the city for years that the lack of opportunity and underfunded youth programs would eventually produce something dangerous, but the storm forming beneath the surface was bigger than anyone predicted. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, police began noticing loosely connected neighborhood crews, groups of youth banding together more for protection and identity than organized crime. These crews weren't yet the powerful forces they would become, but the tension was already building. As years passed, alliances shifted, rivalries sharpened, and personal disputes slowly transformed into larger neighborhood conflicts. By the mid-2000s, Minneapolis authorities began documenting what they described as an emerging divide inside North Minneapolis. Two clusters of neighborhoods, roughly aligning around higher elevation blocks and lower-lying corridors, grew apart. Young men in these areas began referring to themselves not just by block or street but by what would eventually become the now infamous labels, the highs and the lows. It didn't happen overnight. The names evolved informally, growing out of everyday conversations, social media slang, and territorial pride. What began as geographical identity markers slowly hardened into gang identities as disputes escalated. And the moment weapons entered the picture, the conflict took a deadly turn. Court documents and police briefings over the years have consistently described the feud as intensely personal, built on cycles of retaliation, mourning, and revenge. Each loss hardened the divisions. Each year added new members who had grown up hearing stories of cousins, friends, or older siblings caught in earlier clashes. Community members still recall the shift. Elders talk about how kids who once played together in the same parks eventually ended up on opposite sides of a conflict they didn't start but felt obligated to continue. Mothers who lived on the north side during this period remember hearing the early signs of trouble: arguments on corners, sharp spikes in graffiti, and the growing presence of weapons that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Despite this, most residents, families trying to raise children, people working two jobs, elders who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, were not involved in gang activity at all. But their lives were shaped by the rising tension around them. When shots rang out, when police helicopters circled overhead, when memorial posters appeared on telephone poles, everyone felt the weight. Minneapolis law enforcement, stretched thin and often criticized for inconsistent strategies, attempted multiple intervention programs. There were community outreach efforts, juvenile diversion programs, and attempts to negotiate peace through neighborhood leaders. But each attempt seemed to collide with the same reality: the streets had memories, and those memories were long. This environment, stress, division, and territorial fragmentation, set the stage for the arrests and investigations that would later rock Minnesota. When the highs and lows eventually solidified into full-fledged gang factions, they brought with them years of neighborhood history, unhealed wounds, and a generation raised inside a conflict that had outgrown any single person. By the time the first major task forces formed in the early 2010s, the war was no longer brewing. it was already burning. To understand why Minnesota law enforcement eventually launched massive gang takedown operations, you have to look at how the highs and lows shifted from neighborhood identity groups to fully recognized criminal sets. By the early 2010s, Minneapolis police and federal agencies were noticing patterns, repeat offenders clustering around specific blocks, the same names tied to multiple shootings, and coordinated retaliation cycles that suggested an organized hierarchy. The highs generally occupied areas around the higher elevation sections of North Minneapolis. Their presence was strong around blocks that locals knew for dense housing complexes and busy community hubs. The lows, on the other hand, were rooted in the lower elevation corridors closer to certain major avenues and intersections that had long been gathering points for neighborhood youth. Although the terms highs and lows sound geographic, and they were, the deeper meaning grew into something cultural, almost tribal. Members on both sides began using the labels not just to describe where they lived but to define who they were. Social media accelerated this shift dramatically. Instagram posts, Snapchat stories, and early Facebook conflicts turned small disputes into public battlegrounds. A single disrespectful comment could spread across the neighborhood within hours, adding fuel to simmering tension. Law enforcement would later testify in court that online feuds directly led to real-world shootings. Minnesota Department of Public Safety reports from that era documented an alarming trend. Youth between the ages of 14 and 22 were increasingly involved in violent incidents. Schools in the district began noticing more memorial T-shirts, more students missing class after tragedies, and more trauma impacting entire grades. Teachers quietly passed around warnings: two cousins on different sides of the conflict should not be placed in the same after-school program. Certain hallways were better monitored during dismissal. Arguments over social media posts were now potential flashpoints. Yet within this tension, a strange dual reality existed. Leaders, artists, and athletes from the same neighborhoods were rising up, trying to pull kids away from the streets. Local nonprofits held peace walks. Churches organized late-night basketball events and job fairs. Youth mentors worked overtime trying to keep vulnerable teens from slipping into the gravitational pull of the feud. But the streets had their own momentum. By 2013, Minneapolis police reports began naming the highs and lows more frequently, marking them as emerging violent street gangs. But officials repeatedly emphasized something important. These were not massive, structured criminal empires like Los Angeles's or Chicago's largest gangs. Instead, they were tightly woven neighborhood networks, built on personal history, proximity, and shared experience. This made them harder to dismantle. Many members weren't lifelong criminals. Some were teenagers pulled into the feud after losing a friend. Others grew up in families where older siblings were already aligned with one side. Rivalries didn't always start with drug territory or financial motives. Often, they were the continuation of old neighborhood fights that escalated beyond anything previous generations experienced. Still, as the feud intensified, the violence became more frequent and more coordinated. Shooting after shooting appeared in police blotters. Victims and suspects often had connections to the same handful of blocks. What had once been hyperlocal conflicts began affecting citywide safety statistics, drawing the attention of federal agencies. One of the turning points came when investigators connected a series of retaliatory shootings to online threats posted by individuals tied to the highs. Days later, a counterattack was attributed to members of the lows. What made this different from previous cycles was the precision. Investigators noticed planning, shared vehicles, and overlapping suspects. It was no longer just spontaneous violence. It appeared strategic. Hennepin County prosecutors publicly acknowledged that Minneapolis was facing a new era of gang conflict. More resources were allocated to specialized units. Local news stations began highlighting the high versus low feud, and community members, exhausted by years of tension, demanded action. But as law enforcement prepared to intervene, something else was happening behind the scenes. Unofficial leaders on both sides, older members who had survived multiple cycles of violence, were losing influence. A younger, more impulsive generation was rising, shaped by social media, functioning without the traditional internal structures that older gang members once used to maintain control. Without OGs enforcing boundaries or mediating conflicts, even minor disputes exploded into deadly confrontations. This environment created exactly the kind of instability that leads to major arrests. And by the mid-2010s, federal agencies took notice. Task forces assembled quietly. Surveillance increased. Undercover operations targeting both the highs and lows began piecing together the movements, connections, and alliances that would eventually form the basis of some of the largest gang indictments in Minnesota history. But no single arrest triggered the crackdown. Instead, a single summer would provide the final spark, one so deadly it forced Minneapolis into the national spotlight. That's where we go next. Every long-running gang war has a breaking point, a moment when the violence becomes impossible to ignore, when city officials can no longer treat the feud as isolated incidents, and when federal agencies decide the threat has crossed a line. For Minneapolis, that breaking point arrived during a summer that residents still talk about in hushed tones. It wasn't a single shooting or even a single week of chaos. It was a chain reaction, one event triggering another, each retaliation hitting harder than the last. Streets that had spent years simmering with tension finally hit a boil. Residents who had grown used to the background hum of neighborhood conflict suddenly found themselves living in what felt like an active war zone. The summer began with a confrontation at a neighborhood gathering. It wasn't supposed to be violent. It was a community event meant to bring families out for food, music, and fresh air. But when members and affiliates of both the highs and lows crossed paths, an argument broke out, what witnesses later described as old beef resurfacing. A shove turned into fists gave way to weapons, and before the crowd could scatter, shots were fired. That first incident set the tone for what would follow. Within days, a retaliatory shooting hit a block known to be low territory. Minutes after that news spread on social media, high-connected accounts began posting cryptic messages, half taunting, half mourning. Police later testified that these posts acted like gasoline on dry grass. Then came another attack, this time targeting a group loosely associated with the highs. No one was killed, but 2 teenagers were hospitalized. By midsummer, the Northside felt like it was under siege. Parents kept their children inside after sunset. Neighborhood elders warned each other which blocks to avoid. Local convenience stores, normally open late, began closing early. Drivers rolled through stop signs to avoid sitting still at intersections that had become hotspots for drive-by shootings. The Minneapolis Police Department, dealing with a surge in calls, shifted officers into overtime patrols. But even with the heightened presence, they couldn't keep up with the speed of the feud. Officers would respond to a shooting on one block only to be dispatched to another incident minutes later. Community members complained that it felt like police were always reacting, never preventing. What made this summer different was the precision of the violence. Investigators reviewing ballistics and witness reports noticed patterns. Same calibers showing up at different scenes, same groups of suspects spotted near recent shootings, same shifting alliances drawing clear lines between the highs and lows. And while police were overwhelmed, the public pressure grew louder. Local activists held emergency meetings demanding intervention. Neighborhood groups pleaded for resources, trauma counseling, youth outreach, conflict mediation. Mothers who had lost children to the feud spoke at city council sessions, warning officials that unless something drastic changed, the body count would climb. But the most chilling moment, the one that forced the entire city to pay attention, was a daytime shooting near a busy intersection. Witnesses described seeing 2 vehicles pulling up alongside each other before multiple shots erupted. When the chaos ended, an innocent bystander, someone with no connection to either gang, was found critically injured on the sidewalk. That incident pushed the story into national headlines. It wasn't just a Minneapolis problem anymore. It was framed as a public safety crisis. Local leaders held an urgent press conference. Police representatives stood alongside community figures, all acknowledging that the feud had escalated beyond anything the city had prepared for. Behind the scenes, calls were made to federal agencies. The FBI, ATF, and U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed what was happening and quickly agreed. The situation required intervention on a level Minneapolis alone couldn't provide. But while officials prepared a long-term strategy, the violence on the streets didn't pause. The highs and lows continued their cycle, each side convinced they had to strike first to avoid becoming the next headline. Investigators later revealed that during this summer, multiple members on both sides acquired new weapons. Some stolen, some obtained through straw buyers, others trafficked through interstate gun pipelines that federal agents were already monitoring. The availability of guns made each confrontation more dangerous, each disagreement more likely to turn deadly. The breakneck pace of violence strained even long-standing friendships. People who had grown up together found themselves forced to choose sides. Others left the neighborhood entirely, fleeing to St. Paul, Brooklyn Center, or out of state just to escape the crossfire. This was the summer when law enforcement said the war became uncontainable, when Minneapolis saw some of its highest concentrations of gang-related shootings in years. The impact rippled through every corner of the Northside, leaving residents traumatized and law enforcement desperate for a solution. By the end of that summer, investigators had gathered enough evidence, surveillance footage and witness statements to begin building the foundations of major gang indictments. What started as a neighborhood feud was now a full-scale federal target. By the time summer ended, Minneapolis leaders knew that traditional policing alone wouldn't stop the spiraling conflict between the highs and the lows. Too many retaliations, too many guns moving through the neighborhoods, too many suspects crossing city and state lines. The violence wasn't random anymore. It was structured, patterned, and fueled by networks bigger than anything local officers could dismantle on their own. That's when state officials formally reached out to federal agencies. And almost overnight, the situation shifted from a chronic neighborhood problem to a major public safety priority. The first agency to step in was the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. They had already been monitoring an uptick in illegal gun purchases across Minnesota. Reports showed stolen firearms surfacing in Minneapolis crimes within days of disappearing from gun stores miles away. When they cross-referenced ballistic data with police shooting logs, the pattern was unmistakable. Several weapons were bouncing between members of the highs and the lows. At the same time, the FBI Safe Streets Task Force began assembling investigators who specialized in gang intelligence. They pulled data from social media, jail communications, phone records, and prior arrests. Names that had floated around in police reports for years suddenly appeared in organized charts. What once looked like disconnected street conflicts were now mapped into clusters, highs, lows, and multiple affiliate groups that rotated in and out of the feud. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota convened meetings with local prosecutors, reviewing cases that had historically been charged at the county level. But this time, federal prosecutors wanted something bigger: conspiracy charges, weapons trafficking cases, and indictments that could carry the kind of weight state charges couldn't. The goal wasn't just arrests. It was dismantling the networks enabling the violence. The public didn't know any of this yet. But on the north side, residents sensed a change in the air. Unmarked vehicles lingered longer on certain blocks. Surveillance teams monitored alleys and parking lots. Agents quietly contacted community members, seeking information. Some older residents welcomed the increased attention, hoping it would finally bring peace. Others worried it would lead to mass arrests that ignored the complex roots of the conflict. Inside the task force's command rooms, investigators analyzed hundreds of hours of footage from city cameras. They traced vehicles linked to shootings, watching how suspects moved between blocks and stash houses. They combed through social media posts, taunts, threats, photos, symbols, and coded captions that had become a digital battlefield. One chilling discovery emerged during these deep dives. Younger members were escalating disputes far faster than older generations ever did. Arguments that once took days or weeks to grow into violence were now erupting within hours because of online provocations. A single Instagram story could set off a chain of retaliations that left multiple people injured. This volatility made the case for federal intervention even stronger. Another breakthrough came when investigators identified connections between several Minneapolis shootings and out-of-state firearms traffickers. This opened the door to federal gun charges, cases that would carry sentences long enough to remove key players from the street for years. ATF agents tracked the pathways of these weapons, uncovering how they passed through buyers in other states before landing in the hands of high or low members. While investigators built their case, community organizations continued pushing for prevention. They argued that long-term solutions required more than enforcement. Schools needed resources, youth needed programs, and neighborhoods needed economic investment. But law enforcement insisted that with the violence at its peak, the immediate priority was stopping the bloodshed. The tipping point for full-scale federal involvement came when investigators linked a series of shootings to a loosely coordinated group of highs members. According to later court filings, the group used stolen cars, shared weapons, and social media planning to carry out attacks. The lows responded with their own retaliations, turning specific blocks into hostile zones. The FBI classified the conflict as an ongoing violent crime enterprise, allowing them to deploy more resources. Analysts constructed timelines detailing each major incident: who was present, who retaliated, who provided transportation, who supplied weapons. The deeper they dug, the clearer the structure became. By late fall, the task forces had enough evidence to begin drafting multiple sets of indictments. Some targeting weapon trafficking, others focused on violent crimes, and some aimed at conspiracy charges to disrupt the networks on both sides of the feud. But even as federal agents prepared their next moves, the highs and lows remained active. Both sides were still deep in their cycle of retaliation, unaware that surveillance teams were watching their every move and stacking evidence that would lead to the most significant gang arrests Minneapolis had seen in years. The stage was set. The investigations were nearing completion. And what came next would send shockwaves through the entire state. A series of coordinated raids that would change Minnesota's gang landscape forever. Federal investigations do not move quickly, not when they're building cases that could reshape an entire city's street landscape. Months of surveillance, wiretaps, undercover buys, social media monitoring, and forensic tracking went into constructing the blueprint for what would become one of Minnesota's most synchronized gang takedown operations in modern history. And when the day finally arrived, it was planned with the precision of a military operation. Before sunrise, a quiet tension settled over parts of North Minneapolis. Residents later recalled that the neighborhood felt different, as if the streets themselves knew something was coming. Agents from the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals Service assembled in staging areas miles away. Their vehicles, armored SUVs, unmarked units, mobile command posts, lined up in the dark, engines off, ready to move at the exact second the order came through. By 5 a.m., the briefing rooms were buzzing. Maps of the Northside covered tables and screens. Each target had been identified, each address photographed, each suspect assessed for risk level. Agents reviewed floor plans, escape routes, and known associates. Local Minneapolis officers coordinated with federal teams to ensure every location was covered. This wasn't going to be a handful of arrests. This was a sweep. One agent reviewing the plan reportedly said, "This is the largest coordinated operation these neighborhoods have seen in years." Just after dawn, the command signal went out. Within seconds, convoys of law enforcement vehicles poured into the north side. Agents moved with tactical precision, blocking off streets, securing perimeters, and surrounding targeted houses and apartment complexes. Neighbors peered through blinds as flashlights cut across yards and officers in tactical gear approached front doors. At one location tied to members of the Highs, agents used a breaching tool to dismantle a locked entryway in seconds. Inside, suspects were quickly detained as officers swept the building room by room. Firearms were recovered, along with packaging materials suggesting drug distribution. Phone devices were seized and rapidly bagged for digital forensics. Across town, another team converged on a property linked to the Lowe's. This target was considered high risk. Suspects inside had prior weapons charges. Using armored shields and breaching equipment, agents stormed the building with speed and accuracy. They recovered multiple guns, some confirmed stolen from out-of-state dealers, and significant evidence tying the suspects to previous shootings documented by investigators. Residents on nearby blocks described waking up to the sound of helicopters circling overhead. The presence of aerial support wasn't random. Federal teams used helicopters to monitor movement, preventing suspects from fleeing through alleys or jumping between rooftops as officers closed in. In total, more than a dozen locations were hit simultaneously. Each arrest fed into a broader picture, a coordinated federal effort to dismantle the cycle of violence that had plagued Minneapolis for years. Some suspects were taken into custody quietly. Others required lengthy negotiations. A few attempted to escape but were quickly cornered due to the overwhelming law enforcement presence blanketing the area. By mid-morning, word of the crackdown spread through Minneapolis like wildfire. Community members gathered outside, some relieved, others anxious. Parents expressed hope that the raids would bring peace to the blocks where their children played. Elders wondered whether the sudden silence left behind would last or whether new conflicts would rise to fill the vacuum. Inside command centers, meanwhile, agents began processing the first wave of detained suspects, cross-referencing evidence with their months-long investigation. Firearms were logged and matched to ballistic records. Phones were taken to digital labs for extraction. Interviews began immediately. By noon, Minnesota leaders held a press conference announcing the sweeping arrests. Federal officials emphasized that the operation targeted individuals connected to violence, not entire neighborhoods. They stressed that the goal wasn't to criminalize North Minneapolis, but to protect it. Media outlets broadcast headlines describing the arrests as a major blow to gang activity. Some stations highlighted the highs and lows by name, labeling the operation as a turning point in the city's fight against organized violent crime. Yet even as headlines praised the effort, experts warned that takedowns alone never solve gang violence. Removing individuals without addressing the roots of the conflict, poverty, lack of opportunity, intergenerational trauma, creates a temporary pause rather than permanent peace. And on the streets, the immediate aftermath was tense. With key members removed, both the highs and the lows were thrown into disarray. Leadership structures shifted. Younger members were left confused, some fearful, others angry. Police increased patrols to prevent retaliatory chaos, knowing that power vacuums and gang landscapes can become dangerous turning points. But for now, at least for a moment, the Northside was quieter than it had been in years. After a summer of constant gunfire, the sudden silence felt surreal. However, the raids were only the beginning. Next came the indictments, massive, detailed, and staggering in scope, revealing just how deeply the highs and lows had become intertwined with Minneapolis' violent crime landscape. And those documents would change everything. As the dust settled over North Minneapolis, the arrests, indictments, and federal operations left behind a neighborhood standing between two forces: the trauma of its past and the possibility of a different future. The highs and the lows, once just neighborhood labels whispered in alleyways, had become symbols of a conflict bigger than any single block, any single generation, or any single crew. Federal officials called the takedowns a turning point, and in some ways they were. The streets grew quieter. The cycle of rapid retaliation slowed. For the first time in years, longtime residents described walking their blocks without that familiar spike of fear. Children played outside more often. Corner stores stayed open later. The sound of helicopters hovering overhead became less common. But beneath that calm, the deeper truth remained. The arrests didn't erase the pain. They didn't heal the families who had lost sons, brothers, cousins, friends. They didn't rebuild the jobs that disappeared decades earlier. They didn't restore the trust between residents and law enforcement, trust strained by years of tension, miscommunication, and survival. Even after the raids, even after the headlines faded, the people of the Northside were still left with the hardest work of all: rebuilding a community that had been caught in the crossfire of history, economics, and violence. Some former members began speaking publicly, warning younger kids about the realities behind the gang lifestyle, how the loyalty is short-lived, how the violence eats away at every part of you, and how the end is almost always the same: death or prison. Community groups doubled their efforts, launching mentorship programs, job initiatives, conflict resolution workshops, and trauma recovery sessions. Because even with the arrests, everyone knew the truth. You cannot police your way out of generational struggle. It takes opportunity. It takes investment. It takes healing. And most of all, it takes a community united in purpose. Still, the story of the highs and lows remains one of Minnesota's most important modern tragedies, a reminder of how quickly neighborhood disputes can grow into something larger, something deadlier, something that shapes the identity of an entire city. The federal crackdown may have slowed the violence, but it didn't erase the scars. For the families who lived through it, for the kids who lost childhoods to gunfire, and for the neighborhoods still searching for peace, the Northside story is far from over. And maybe that's why it's so important to tell stories like this. Because hidden inside the headlines and police reports are real people, real choices, and real consequences. Understanding the past is the first step toward preventing it from repeating. If you've watched this documentary to the end, thank you. These stories matter. These communities matter. Their struggles, their victories, their voices, all deserve to be heard. Before you go, do one thing that helps this channel bring more real, fact-based crime stories to viewers around the world. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps to shine a light on the stories that rarely get told in full. This is not just about gangs. Not just about violence. Not just about Minneapolis. It's about what happens when a city reaches its breaking point, and what it takes to rebuild after the smoke clears. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. And until our next deep dive, stay aware.